The night progressed with a strange, almost unnatural rhythm, as if every minute were stretching longer than usual. According to audio released anonymously, it was around 8 in the evening when the atmosphere inside the hall began to acquire a tension that was difficult to ignore. The warm light of the lamps failed to soften the sensation of discomfort spreading among the tables. Some guests spoke in hushed tones, others drank to fill the silence, but everything seemed wrapped in a dense atmosphere, sustained by something no one wanted to name. In a corner of the hall, practically hidden by the shadow cast by a column, sat Yu Menglong. According to the disseminated testimony, his posture was rigid, as if every movement cost him effort. His hands rested on his thighs, slightly trembling, while he tried to maintain a neutral expression. Around him, several men dressed in black moved with an unsettling familiarity. One of them approached every so often to serve him more alcohol, tilting the bottle with a smile that did not reach his eyes. Menglong barely grazed the rim of the glass with his lips, taking only a small, almost symbolic sip. The testimony relates that his gaze avoided direct contact, as if he feared provoking something simply by raising his eyes. Even so, his tension was evident. In an environment where everything was supposed to be a celebration, his presence contrasted abruptly. The account describes that he seemed very displeased, almost forced to be there, a guest trapped in a role he had not chosen. As the night wore on, the music became louder, the faces redder, and the atmosphere more charged. Around 11:20, as narrated, the first break occurred. An employee, identified only as Xiao Wei, was returning from the restroom when she heard a sharp noise, a thud that did not correspond with the normal bustle of the party. Curiosity overcame fear. She approached the ajar door and, upon looking inside, the emotional impact left her paralyzed. According to her statement, a burly man, dressed in a dark suit, was holding Menglong by the shoulders and covering his mouth with his right hand. The actor's body moved in an uncoordinated manner, as if trying to resist without having enough strength left. The back of the sofa had been displaced by the force of his movements, and his shirt, according to the witness, was partially torn, leaving part of his abdomen exposed. At that instant, the man in the suit, the account continues, turned his head toward the door with an aggression that cut off one's breath. His eyes, described as extremely hostile, locked onto the employee. He pointed a finger at her and, according to the audio, uttered a threat that froze the blood of the listener. The young woman, on the verge of panic, dropped the tray she was carrying and fled without looking back. When she gathered the courage to return, a few seconds later, she saw Menglong lying back on the sofa, apparently immobilized. The testimony adds that other men, 3 or 4, dressed informally, had begun to pour alcohol directly from the bottle into his mouth. According to this version, the liquid spilled over his skin, sliding down his neck and soaking his clothes, while he tried to move his head to avoid it. One of those present, identified in the narration as the man in the patterned shirt, reportedly reacted with rage when Menglong vomited amidst the struggle. The vomit splattered his clothes, which according to the account detonated a violent outburst. The man grabbed a bottle and, consistently with the testimony, smashed it against the actor's face. The witness claims to have seen drops of a reddish liquid on the mouth of one of the empty bottles, although she could not confirm if it was truly blood. Later, when the room was finally empty, another employee of the venue claimed to have found more than 10 bottles of strong liquor piled in a corner, some still wet. These details, unverified by any official source, became loose pieces of a puzzle that many have tried to reconstruct since then. The same witness added that, at the end of the gathering, he saw 2 men taking Menglong out of the place. According to his account, his head hung to one side, his legs trembled involuntarily, and his body seemed incapable of supporting itself. At that moment, the employee thought it was simply an excess of alcohol, a common episode at parties of this type. However, after hearing the other accounts, he publicly admitted that perhaps it had been something more serious. The next morning, it is said, the police arrived at the scene and ordered the employees not to comment on anything that had occurred. No one dared to contradict that instruction. The presence of the authorities, far from alleviating, seemed to increase the bewilderment among those present. The silence was immediate, almost automatic, as if a shadow had fallen over every unspoken word. Shortly after, when the news of Menglong's death began to circulate, the initial fear transformed into a sensation of guilt and anguish among those who were there that night. It was only when the actor's mother appeared crying on social media, always according to the disseminated testimonies, that some employees dared to reveal, anonymously, what they believed they had witnessed. Thus, the story of the inevitable night did not emerge from a single voice, but from the sum of scattered fragments, pieces of an emotional mosaic narrated by people who, they say, would prefer to erase what happened from their memory. This first set of testimonies illustrates not only the critical minutes, but also a more complex background, the fear, the pressure, the idea that, in certain circles, staying silent is the only possible alternative. And it is precisely there where the root of the problem emerges. The case cannot be analyzed solely as an isolated episode of violence, but as part of a deeper structure, described by those who know the industry as a system where power, obligation, and silent control intertwine. According to later statements, the atmosphere of that night would not have been an exception, but an extreme manifestation of dynamics that, according to diverse sources, exist in the less visible layers of entertainment. The night of the event, always from a narrative point of view and based on unverified testimonies, represents the turning point. It was not a sudden act nor an outburst without context. It was, according to these accounts, the culmination of accumulated pressures, unfulfilled expectations, and tensions inherent to an environment where obedience is valued more than individuality. Understanding those final minutes implies looking back and examining a system that many describe as hermetic, hierarchical, and difficult to challenge. In that intersection between silence, power, and vulnerability lies the root of this story, a fragile balance that night, ended up breaking. The news propagated first as a whisper, then as an unsettling murmur, and finally as a roar impossible to contain. Barely a few hours after that night described in multiple unverified testimonies, the first fragments began to circulate. Ambiguous messages, posts deleted with unusual speed, and questions that seemed to arise from all directions. The death of Yu Menglong, an actor whose public image had always been synonymous with serenity, triggered an immediate and explosive reaction on the networks. According to various observations from users who managed to bypass censorship, the first 24 hours were a silent chaos. Thousands of comments appeared only to disappear in minutes. Hashtags that became trending were suddenly blocked. Profiles that tried to share testimonies claimed to have been restricted. Information did not flow naturally, but in jumps as if struggling to break through increasingly strict containment mechanisms. It was precisely this instability that further fueled public suspicion. Every deleted post became indirect proof for some, a rumor for others, but above all, emotional fuel that made it so the case could not be easily extinguished. In parallel, thousands of users outside China's digital borders began to disseminate screenshots, transcripts, and recordings that they claimed to have obtained through alternative channels. Although none of this had official verification, the speed with which these fragments spread was extraordinary. In a matter of hours, international forums, analysis accounts, and channels dedicated to entertainment news were already discussing the case with increasing intensity. The emotional impact was immediate. For many, Menglong represented an almost intangible figure, someone whose public personality embodied a type of purity uncommon in the entertainment industry. The idea that his death could be wrapped in circumstances not yet clarified created a wave of shock difficult to quantify. Comments like, "It can't be true," "This doesn't fit his image," or "There must be something more behind this," were replicated thousands of times. However, the reaction was not homogeneous. While one sector demanded clarity and justice, another showed caution, recalling that none of the disseminated information had been confirmed by authorities or official media. This division was especially visible in international communities. Some users argued that only amplified disinformation was circulating. Others insisted that censorship was precisely the reason why it was necessary to keep sharing any available testimony. What was indisputable was the speed with which a spontaneous movement was created. Phrases like, "Let's not let them forget him," "Don't erase his story," or "May his voice stay alive," began to repeat in multiple languages. Even those who did not know Menglong's trajectory joined in, moved by the sensation of witnessing something that should not be silenced. Video platforms also became involved without intending to. According to some content creators, several clips mentioning the case were demonetized or marked as sensitive. Others claimed that the visibility of their posts was drastically reduced in a matter of minutes. All of this contributed to reinforcing the narrative that there was an attempt to limit public discussion. In this climate of uncertainty, the first, more elaborate reactions emerged. In-depth analyses, temporal reconstructions based only on the disseminated testimonies, and videos trying to contextualize the case within problems already known in the industry. The tone of these publications varied from formal restraint to expressions of collective sadness. But they all shared a common element: the impossibility of ignoring the topic. The most significant moment of this media avalanche occurred when the audio attributed to the event staff was disseminated. Although its authenticity could not be confirmed, it functioned as an emotional catalyst. The minute descriptions of the environment, Menglong's gestures, the noises inside the hall, all of this allowed listeners to visualize the scene in an almost cinematographic way. And as often happens, when an image installs itself in the collective mind, the debate ceases to be purely rational. It was then that a question arose, which was replicated thousands of times. "What do you think of this? Comment "Amen" below so we can continue with the unfinished stories." That phrase, repeated in different languages, transformed the discussion into a participatory phenomenon. It was not solely about observing a case, but about sustaining the memory of someone whom many perceived as deeply vulnerable. On an emotional level, Menglong's figure began to acquire symbolic dimensions. People spoke of his apparent kindness, of the calm he transmitted, of the discreet gestures that characterized him. Even people who had never seen his dramas or interviews claimed to feel a type of unexpected connection with the story. This process, known in media analysis as cultural martyr construction, usually occurs when a public figure embodies values that the audience considers threatened. On a practical level, there were also repercussions. Some audiovisual projects in which Menglong had participated began to circulate again on international platforms, driven by a wave of solidarity. In several Spanish-speaking countries, entertainment channels conducted retrospectives on his career, highlighting the elegance of his acting and the gentleness of his scenic presence. None of this changed the lack of official information, but it did contribute to reinforcing global attention on his case. On the other hand, the silence of formal institutions became a narrative element in itself. The absence of detailed statements generated a void that was quickly filled by conjectures, alternative analyses, and theories that varied in intensity. This informational void transformed into the main engine of the media avalanche. When a clear official version does not exist, every fragment, every audio, every anonymous testimony gains disproportionate relevance. As the days passed, the case ceased to belong solely to the realm of Menglong's admirers and went on to become a transnational cultural phenomenon. Some Latin American users began to carry out campaigns to keep the conversation alive, while others from Europe focused on highlighting the need to protect workers in the entertainment industry in contexts of high vulnerability. The case, ultimately, transcended the individual figure of the actor and became a discussion about power, silence, and the dangers of that which cannot be said openly. The echo of that media avalanche continues to resonate, not because clear answers exist, but because the questions persist. And in that constant questioning, the story continues. Crisis management does not begin when the first public question arises, but when the truth, whatever it may be, crashes against a wall of silence. In the case of Yu Menglong, according to the multiple unverified testimonies that circulated in the days following his death, that wall appeared immediately. Before the public could even formulate a concrete question, a climate of informational containment had already been installed, a strategy that, far from calming the waters, seemed to intensify the collective disquiet. The first movement within the crisis chessboard was according to observers' absence. No detailed declaration, no extensive communiqué, no visible effort to clarify what happened. Silence is a powerful tool when used to protect privacy or allow a rigorous investigation, but it can also become a trigger for suspicions when the context is already charged with tension. Here, according to the analyses of users and content creators, the lack of answers was interpreted as a calculated maneuver to control the narrative. Unlike other media cases where a public figure or agency takes the floor to offer condolences, preliminary explanations, or commitments to transparency, this case began without an official voice guiding the conversation. The result was immediate. The digital citizenry constructed its own account. The voids were filled by conjectures, hypotheses, and reconstructions based on testimonies disseminated by third parties. The second movement within this crisis management was the fragmented reaction of those who were closest to the actor. Some acquaintances, always according to unverified testimonies, expressed in private that they could not speak openly. Others claimed they had been advised not to comment. None of these accounts can be confirmed, but the collective perception they generated was potent. A circle of silence surrounded what occurred. Menglong's family, according to the posts that circulated, was the most visible exception. The appearance of his mother crying before cameras and on social media, which, according to users, was quickly deleted or restricted on some platforms, became an emotional turning point. While the family showed evident pain, the institutional narrative continued to be minimal, almost non-existent. From a crisis management perspective, this dissonance created a conflict between public emotion and structural silence. A third key element within the strategy, or the absence of one, was the alleged immediate intervention in the spaces where the party occurred. According to the disseminated accounts, the police reportedly arrived early the next morning to conduct an inspection and request employees not to comment on details of the event. Although this information is not verified, the perception it produced was that there was a desire to limit any spontaneous dissemination. In crisis logic, acts interpreted as damage control usually generate the opposite effect, multiplying attention on that which one attempts to control. On the other hand, in cases of celebrities with international projection, the release of an official statement from the artist's representation team is usually habitual. However, in this story, according to users who followed the case in real time, there was no extensive declaration from the team explaining the emotional, physical, or professional state of the actor before the incident. The absence of a structured message left space for something worse than a rumor: the perception of abandonment. This void led to a fourth critical point within crisis management: the public construction of responsibilities. According to the testimonies that circulated after Menglong's death, there were tensions within his work environment, contractual pressures and dynamics of control difficult to ignore. But as no involved party issued detailed statements to confirm or refute these assertions, the audience was forced to create its own system of interpretation. Some analysis videos that surfaced on international platforms pointed out that a well-managed crisis requires a clear timeline, a coherent stance, a central message, a follow-up plan. In this case, according to these evaluations, none of these elements were present. The fifth movement, or the fifth strategic absence, was the lack of a unified discourse. While independent media translated and replicated testimonies, while users on social media produced analyses from different countries, no institutional voice sought to unify the narrative or provide verifiable data. From a public relations perspective, this left fertile ground for multiple interpretations and intense emotions. Crisis management in any industry is always found at the limit between transparency and containment. However, when handled in a fragmented manner, what various observers described in this case happens. The account becomes ungovernable. Without guidance, the media avalanche feeds itself, and any belated word lacks impact. The last element within this analysis is perhaps the most decisive: the sensation of inevitability. Several international commentators observed that the lack of visible actions to clarify the case reinforced a narrative of public impotence. The idea that there would be no answers, no clear apologies, no complete explanations, no transparent commitments, became part of the collective imaginary. Even those who opted for a prudent approach, insisting on not drawing conclusions without verification, coincided on something. The crisis management offered no path for the citizenry to have clarity. There were no spaces for public information, no sequential communiques, no calls for patience backed by data. The handling of the crisis surrounding Menglong's death ended up being, according to content analyses, a case where the most visible strategy was the absence of strategy. Every silence increased the pressure. Every deleted post intensified speculation. Every lack of explanation amplified the collective anguish. Therefore, the case ended up offering a painful but significant lesson in terms of communication. When the official narrative completely retreats, the public narrative occupies its place, and it does so with an uncontrollable, emotional, and deeply human force. And so, at the intersection between the lack of answers and the need to understand, this part of the account is born. A crisis chessboard where every square remained marked by absence, time, and distrust. The passage of time, far from appeasing the conversation surrounding Yu Menglong, seemed to intensify it. Once the media avalanche reached its peak and the crisis management left more questions than answers, the public narrative began to shift toward a different territory: the search for meaning. This phase, known in communication studies as narrative reconstruction, usually emerges when society attempts to understand not only what happened, but also its long-term implications. And in this case, those implications extended far beyond the events of the night in question. According to diverse, unverified testimonies that emerged weeks later, some individuals close to the actor claimed that Menglong had expressed professional discomforts in the previous months. These accounts describe a scenario where contractual pressures, impossible expectations, and an environment that, always according to the disseminated declarations, seemed to demand absolute obedience, were mixed. Although such assertions have not been confirmed by official sources, the public perception was that the actor's vulnerability was not an isolated circumstance, but part of a broader context. This context generated a deeper reflection on the structures of power in the entertainment industry. Experts in media analysis pointed out that, regardless of the veracity of the testimonies, the collective reaction evidenced a greater disquiet, the sensation that artists can become trapped in systems where autonomy is limited and media exposure does not always carry real protection. This type of reflection transcended Menglong's individual figure and became a critique of broader dynamics. Amidst this process, another relevant dimension emerged: the lasting emotional impact among the actor's followers. Many described the experience as a rupture, a perception of loss that not only affected those who admired his artistic trajectory, but also those who saw in him a representation of sensitivity and tranquility. In international forums, posts began to appear speaking of the peaceful light that Menglong transmitted on screen, of his serene gaze, of the way his presence evoked calm. The way these descriptions repeated demonstrated that, for many, Menglong had transcended the role of celebrity to adopt a more symbolic one, that of a figure whose vulnerability reflected the audience's own vulnerabilities. The emergence of this symbolism had a particular effect on the collective narrative. Instead of focusing exclusively on the events of the night described in the testimonies, the conversation began to incorporate personal stories, memories of series, translated interviews, and specific moments of the actor's career. Without seeking it, Menglong became a point of emotional convergence. This type of phenomenon, the consolidation of a public figure as an emotional reference, usually occurs when the public feels that injustice or loss affects not only the person, but a broader cultural ideal. However, this phase of reconstruction was not exempt from tension. As discussions about the need for transparency increased, so did calls to act responsibly, avoiding hasty conclusions. Some analysts insisted that, without verifiable evidence, no theory should be presented as definitive. This contrast between the need for clarity and the obligation of prudence became one of the most complex aspects of the conversation. At the same time, discussions emerged regarding the legal and structural repercussions of the case. Although no official sanctions related to the narrated events were published, the public began to question supervision mechanisms and protection protocols for public figures within certain professional environments. In several open debates, it was posited that, regardless of what happened the night of the incident, the industry needed to review the way it handled situations of vulnerability. Meanwhile, Menglong's figure kept growing in the collective imaginary. People who did not know him began to take an interest in his work, to watch his series, to search for old interviews. Others created illustrations, open letters, compilation videos, all as a way to keep his memory alive, as some users expressed. This phenomenon reflects a principle known in media sociology. When a case remains surrounded by official silence, the public tends to build its own space of homage, a space that functions as symbolic resistance against the lack of clarity. The sensation of emotional injustice also drove transnational actions. In Spanish-speaking communities, petitions began to emerge so that the case would not be forgotten. In other regions, some groups requested the review of working conditions in the entertainment industry, arguing that extreme pressure can generate dangerous environments. Although these initiatives were not coordinated with each other, their existence demonstrated that the impact of the case had transcended borders. As days turned into weeks, it became clear that the narrative reconstruction was taking two main directions. The first was introspective, a reflection on the value of empathy, human fragility, and the loneliness faced by some public figures. The second was structural, an analysis of the forces that operate behind the industry and the way such forces can shape or distort the lives of those who work in it. On both paths, Menglong became a figure that invited reflection. Not because there was official information confirming his situation, but because his public image, the softness of his voice, the calm of his gestures, the delicacy with which he interpreted his characters, formed a radical contrast with the emotional whirlwind that surrounded his final days. That contrast shocked the public in a profound way. It is here where the most delicate component of the reconstruction process arises: hope. Despite the institutional silence, many people began to express a common desire: that one day the facts be clarified. It was not solely about obtaining answers, but about providing dignity to a story that, according to the actor's followers, did not deserve to remain trapped in darkness. But even beyond that desire, the case opened a broader conversation about how society processes loss, especially when loss is wrapped in uncertainty. Menglong's story, as reconstructed through multiple unverified voices, highlighted the collective need to find meaning even amidst unanswered questions. Thus, the long road toward reconstruction is not just an emotional journey for those who admired the actor. It is also a mirror that reflects the fragilities of complex systems, the need for protection for the most vulnerable, and the importance of guaranteeing safe spaces within highly competitive industries. This process continues, and it will remain active as long as the case stays open in the collective memory. Because beyond the information that can be officially published, there exists a persistent desire that no story, especially one surrounded by pain, silence, and bewilderment, be relegated to oblivion. Looking back and contemplating every fragment that makes up this story, an undeniable truth emerges. Beyond the testimonies, beyond the doubts, and the lack of official clarity, the case of Yu Menglong has become a symbol of something deeper. His name no longer belongs solely to the entertainment industry. It now inhabits a collective emotional space where vulnerability, bewilderment, and the human need to understand that which remains in the shadows coexist. This narrative journey has taken us from the tensest moments of that night to the way society reacted, first with confusion, then with a torrent of emotions that overflowed any attempt at control. We have explored the absence of a solid crisis management strategy, as well as the silences that ended up amplifying uncertainty. And finally, we have observed how Menglong's memory grew beyond the facts, transforming into a mirror where every spectator projects questions about power, fragility, and dignity. If this story demonstrates anything, it is that, even amidst the darkness, there is a constant drive to seek meaning. Menglong's reconstruction is not limited to his figure. It represents the collective desire not to allow silence to be the final word. A society that questions, that observes, and that demands clarity is a society that refuses to resign itself. Therefore, even though there may still be unanswered questions, the echo of this story will continue to resonate. Not because someone imposes it, but because thousands of voices have decided not to let it fall into oblivion. And that decision, emotional, human, and deeply symbolic, is perhaps the most powerful act within this account. Even when we cannot change the past, we can decide what to do with what we have learned. Menglong's memory, as it has been reconstructed by those who have held onto it with respect and sensitivity, becomes a reminder of the importance of protecting the most vulnerable, of demanding transparency, and of not allowing uncertainty to become a habit. Ultimately, this story does not end here. It stays alive in those who continue asking, in those who seek to understand, and in those who feel that the dignity of a person deserves more than silence. If this story moved you, we invite you to keep it alive. Share this video so that more people can know it and reflect on its implications. We do not intend to impose conclusions. We only seek that no voice, no memory, and no story marked by pain remain relegated to darkness. Your participation is essential. Share, comment, and keep the conversation open. Because as long as there are those who want to know more, Yu Menglong's story will not be erased.